What you're describing and what I've been very interested in for actually 2 decades is fake history, which I think is far more dangerous because it creates overarching narratives that people take for granted, and then they sift reality, they sift current events through this paradigm.
Who is shaking the ant jar? Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining me once again on GBN Originals. I'm about to introduce my latest guest for a scintillating, informative, inspiring conversation. That guest today is Raymond Ibrahim. He is an academic, I would say, first and foremost, expert in the history of Christendom and the history of Islam and the Middle East. He's also an author, podcaster. Amongst his books are Defenders of the West, Sword and Scimitar, The Al-Qaeda Reader, and The Battle of Yarmouk, all of which are available wherever you get your books, and you'll find details in the links below. Raymond Ibrahim, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Neil. Great to be with you. Thanks.
Good. To get right into it, I almost don't know where to begin, although I do. There's so much misunderstanding, I would say, if not downright ignorance, in viewing current events in a vacuum. So much of what people seem to be presented with, they accept as though it had no backstory, which in critical ways makes a lot of events almost meaningless. They're so devoid of context. But history is a powerful tool for eliminating that vacuum, no?
Yeah, this is the point that I've been kind of trying to hammer lately. Everyone knows about fake news, and we know how dangerous fake news is, right? It's a narrative, but it's ephemeral, it's short-lived, it creates its mischief, it moves on, and, people figure it out or they don't. Obviously, it's bad. But what you're describing and what I've been very interested in for actually 2 decades is fake history, which I think is far more dangerous because it creates overarching narratives that people take for granted, and then they sift reality, they sift current events through this paradigm. So as you were saying, everything's being presented in a vacuum, or worse, there's supposedly in the background some shared knowledge of history, but it's often wrong, it's fake, it's intentionally devised that way. So like I said, so people can understand reality through this negative, fake, false paradigm.
What would you say drives this kind of academic misbehavior? I would ask that question in the context of, as I see it, the West, call it the Christian West, call it the secular Christian West, is, to my eyes, being the target of a controlled demolition. British, European civilization is being taken apart brick by brick, down to the foundations and beyond. And yet it's being driven, or at least we're invited to see it being driven, not by barbarians at the gates, but by the sons and daughters of that civilization that are presented to us as the de facto leaders, the elected leaders of those countries. But is that who's driving this destruction, or is it coming from somewhere else that you've come to understand as a product of your study?
Well, first, to unpack the earlier part of what you said, because it's very important, and it's, in my opinion, unprecedented. What you're saying is basically the attack on Western civilization, unlike historically. For example, I write about the Islamic jihad for centuries on Europe and Christian territories and other non-Christian territory, non-Muslim. What's happening today is so unprecedented in that it's the very actual people, the descendants of those Europeans, who are facilitating their own destruction. This is so unheard of. Europe was actually, people forget, Europe, when you think of Christianity and Christendom, you think Europe, medieval era. The reality is, before Islam came on the scene, Europe was sort of the small portion of Christendom. The greater, larger portion was in the middle, what we call today the Middle East and North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt and all of the Middle East, all of Asia Minor, today Turkey. That was the heart of the Christian world. So you had 5 major centers. Only one was in Europe, Rome. And the rest were Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and later Constantinople, which is right there, barely touching Anatolia, essentially. All of those got conquered and stripped from Christendom. And all that was left was little Europe, which was separated and which was the backward part of Christendom at the time. This is why Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Nova Roma or Constantinople. So my point in telling you all this is that from the very beginning, Europe was just being bombarded because after North Africa and the Middle East were swallowed up in the 7th century by the Islamic conquest, and then Spain got conquered. So even portions of Europe until, Muhammad dies in 632 and 732. You have Muslims in Tours or Poitiers. You have that battle and they're still there. So, and you get more iterations later, the Turks, and they go into Asia, into the Balkans, etc. So the reality is Europe was always the final bastion of Christendom. And they saw themselves as that, and they were doing everything to defend against Islamic attacks and other attacks from other non-Christian actors, who were a little more ephemeral because they didn't have a religious ideology driving them, such as the Vikings and the Magyars from the East and so forth. But it's now you fast forward and after centuries of this, and finally the West survives and actually triumphs and the Islamic world starts to wither away. You have the colonial era, essentially, which is the exact opposite. Now Islam's on the retreat and the West is expanding. And now you come to our day and era, and the West is going out of its way to bring in a very hostile civilization amongst itself. And guess what? It acts hostilely. And you see what's happening in these European regions that have very large Muslim migrant populations, right? We can get into that. But so, and the more it becomes obvious, it seems like European leaders do more to bring it in and to cover for it. And as I understand in the UK, what we're saying right now will get you, I don't know, arrested apparently, in some cases.
It's absolutely extraordinary here. I write and talk about it all the time at the moment, but in the last couple of years, there have been of the order of 12,000 arrests in the UK each year, 33 a day, all about social media posts. Things that people have said and shared with the wider world via social media. And it's reached such a pitch. There's a case at the moment, Lucy Connolly, who's a mother and childminder, and she made a post in the aftermath of the Southport murders, a very angry post, by her own admission, about immigrants, which she subsequently took down and apologised for within hours. But nonetheless, she was jailed for 2.5 years. Her appeal against that conviction has recently failed. And time has shown that she has received a longer sentence than has been handed down to people found guilty of child rape. Now, one looks on at that and sees it's like the shaking of the ant jar. People are so angry and so legitimately and understandably angry. But again, as an associated question, I ask, who is shaking the ant jar? The squabbles that are being instigated between groups acrimonious to one another is one thing and understandable. But, up above is the hand that shakes the ant jar. And it's this that I find mystifying, that the West is being shaken apart by its own leaders. And I ask again, why? To what end?
Well, okay, the superficial veneer is that they're driven by, what's in America is called, extreme far leftist or woke ideology, which is basically, stupidity and madness. It's this idea, going back to what we were saying, which is, the white man has to, do everything to make up for his evil past history, and he has to take in migrants, and he needs to shut up. He can't criticize. Who's he to talk? He has to open his borders. It's now, his turn to deal with it, etc. I mean, that's the veneer. And that's sort of what, the right is angry about. And it talks about the stupid left, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that's all a distraction. I think that's what you're getting at. Because that's basically the puppet show that we're watching, but above and beyond it all is the hand that's moving all this. So with you, I agree that above and beyond it all, there's a more nefarious agenda that moves what we see and what the news talks about and what the left and the right argue about all day, which is all just a distraction to me. It's all moving in the same direction, ultimately. No matter no matter the names and the faces that keep, being recycled politically, it's not much has changed. And, I'll stop there for now.
But I want to really get into what I think is a hidden ongoing atrocity to which you stubbornly draw attention. Which is to say, let's say we talk about Christendom, and for most people now it does mean the West. Although, as you rightly point out, the lion's share of Christendom was elsewhere. 4/5 of it were across what we now call the Middle East. Christian Armenia, Syria, Egypt, all of it, North Africa, and so on and so on. But in any event, there is Christendom in the West, however much of a misunderstanding of the global reality that is. And we're always told at school about Judeo-Christian civilization, but for me, really, it is Christian civilization. The significant civilizing force has been Christianity, I would say, and that's just my opinion. And it also seems to me that while we have much attention drawn to any attack on Islam and Muslims, and we call it, a word has been coined, which is Islamophobia, and any attack on Jewish people or the Jewish faith, we have a word for that, which is anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic behaviour. And yet there's relentless persecution of Christianity, and there has been for centuries. And it shows no signs of slackening. Churches are burned, by the score every day in Europe. No one comments upon it. There's no word for that kind of persecution. Christians are beheaded routinely in African countries, sub-Saharan countries and elsewhere. Christianity has been driven to the point of extinction in the home of Christianity, which is the Christian countries of the Middle East that you describe. And yet, why? Why is Christianity, of the three great so-called monotheisms, the target that we don't talk about?
Yeah, good question. And, I'd just like to elaborate on some of the stuff you said, because the persecution of Christians is actually one of my specialties going now for 15, 20 years. I have a book about it that came out in 2013, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. And, it's a lot worse than you even think. Okay. I follow this, and there's statistics that come out every year. And so in 2024, based on a report that was released in 2025 called the World Watch List by an international human rights organization, something like 380 million Christians around the world are persecuted. 2 in 5 in Asia. All right. Which comes out to 40%. So of all the Christians in Asia, 40% are literally being persecuted. You mentioned the carnage in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's very real. Nigeria, there's literally a bona fide genocide going on at the hands of Muslims against Christians. All right. And, every month I write a report called Muslim Persecution of Christians. And I've been doing this since 2011, every month. So 12 a year. And when I came up with this idea, I thought, maybe a month will come and I won't have many stories. One story. What kind of report is that? That's never happened. It's been at least 1 or 2 dozen stories. Okay. For, going now, 15 years, 14 years. And none of those stories, virtually none of them make it into the media. But if it was the opposite, if it was, a Christian persecuting another member of the, human faiths that you mentioned, it would be all plastered 24/7. Okay. It gets literally nothing. One study showed how, the 21 Coptic Christians who were beheaded in Libya in 2015 literally because they rejected embracing Islam and ISIS. They're in the orange jumpsuits on the beach and they carved their heads off. That got something like 10% coverage of the inadvertent killing of a gorilla in the United States that happened like on the same day. Okay. That was the big story. It wasn't that 21 people, died for their faith, for their Christian faith, and were beheaded for it. It was that story. And to give you another example of how, intentional this is, you're familiar with the New Zealand, mosque attack. I forget, was it 2019 or I forget the year, but
I forget the year, but yes, I remember the event.
Yeah, where it's, I think, an Australian man went into some mosques in New Zealand and killed something like 50 Muslims. Okay, yeah, obviously that's a horrific event to be condemned, et cetera, et cetera. But because of that one solitary event, very rare aberration that happens, okay, the United Nations and all these other, major organizations use the date of that incident to create something like Combat Islamophobia Day. All right. Now, I did a little comparison at that time, and I showed how that if you looked at just the month when that happened, there were something like 10 attacks on Christian churches, and the death toll of the Christians was more like 1,000. A lot of them in Nigeria, etc. And all of those, they never connect them. They never talk about them. They'll say they'll say it's climate change that's driving this, for example, in Nigeria. And they'll just dissemble and conceal and do it. So if you're just a regular, denizen of the world, to you, because of the way they prop up what happened in New Zealand, you think that's the real problem, that Christians are killing Muslims, poor innocent Muslims. In reality, it's 100 times worse in reverse. It's Muslims and non-Muslims. All around the world now, it's gotten really bad. In India, for example. Go ahead.
Why is that? Why does the Christian faith, I think it is still the largest faith on the planet in terms of, functioning members of it. Why is there this collective shoulder shrug, turning the other cheek almost literally? Why would that be? Because it's no new phenomenon is the point. And there have been so many examples down through history of not just, which is worse, the killing of actual people, but it's the ritualized degrading of Christianity that occurs again and again and again. One of the things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, was a denigration of priests and Christians, and a desecration of holy places, and the beatifying of Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, and all sorts of mockery of Christianity. And something similar happened in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Judas was made a saint again. Christians were murdered on a colossal scale for no apparent reason by the Bolsheviks amongst the tens of millions of people, Russians, who were killed. It's an ongoing, dreadful pattern of murder of people in uncounted numbers, but also the mockery and the degradation of the faith itself, to which Christianity seems to make no response.
Yeah. So 2 points there. First, I completely agree with you. And I'll be honest with you, I was born and raised as a Christian, Coptic Orthodox variety. And, a lot of people become Christian or serious about their faith because they read the Bible or they had an experience. Believe it or not, one of the most compelling reasons for me to take Christianity very seriously has been my knowledge of history and current events. I've never seen such a good message, the gospel, a good, and something that has been a civilizing force throughout history, so utterly hated as it is, so utterly under attack, so much deception against it, so much undermining against it, so much hostility and, just everything from all sides. That to me has been one of the most compelling proofs of its authenticity. If you really think about it. So I completely agree with you. It's from all sides, from all angles, the amount of lies against it. And what is Christianity? It's the civilizing force that's done so much good for humanity. It was Christians, European Christians, who abolished slavery. And yet till this day, going back to what I was saying about the fake history, it's whites who created slavery, and somehow, they're the chief purveyors still of it somehow. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, why Christians are, I think, succumbing to this. And this is also a little bit diabolical. It's, if you look at the history of Christianity, it was actually something of a muscular and robust religion. Okay. It wasn't the religion of weeping, crying women. All right. It was actually a very masculine religion. And you see echoes of this all throughout Europe in these massive cathedrals that were once filled with booming voices, masculine voices. Okay. I know now they're the haunts of little old women lighting candles for their dearly departed ones. And that's about it. But what happened is, I think there's been a force that has been pushing on Christians the idea that their job and the entire message of Christianity and its whole purpose is for you to shut up and turn the other cheek and be a doormat. Okay. That's good Christianity. If you don't do that, okay, then you're a horrible, evil, you're Hitler, essentially. That's it. So you want to be a good Christian. And this is coming from every angle, from the pews, from the pulpits. It's coming from, the church leaders themselves. It's in the media. I remember watching the Super Bowl, and the commercial, all of a sudden this big commercial comes, it's all quiet, and all you see is people washing people's feet. And then in the end it says Jesus washed feet. He didn't preach hate. And the whole video was the people washing the feet were all white, and the people getting their feet washed were blacks and Muslims and homosexuals and anything you can think of. And so again, the idea is shut up. Don't be critical about any ideology. Don't be critical. Your job is to be a doormat. So I do believe, and this is the concept of a heresy. A heresy is you take one truth, but then you exaggerate it and you forget other truths. So Christianity was always balanced. Of course, there's turn the other cheek and forgive and love much more than any other religion. But it didn't say to be a doormat. Christ himself is the one who, hurled tables and whipped people. Okay. So there is a time and a place for that as well. And the Christians in the Crusades, for example, that's a perfect example. Or if you look at the Knights of the Temple and the Hospital, I mean, these were the most pious Christians, but they were also the most violent. And there was no quarrel in this. It didn't bother them because it was part of just war. Of course, just war is acceptable to Christianity. So I think part of the way Christians have been paralyzed today into accepting getting slapped around is they've been taught to become just doormats. And frankly, it's easier to act like a doormat. So there's also a little cowardice involved here. It's a sort of, you make a virtue of a vice, cowardice. It's much easier not to be confrontational. It's much easier to let people get away with whatever they're doing and for you to turn the other cheek. It's a lot easier than actually standing up for it. So all of these forces combined, I think have led us to where we are.
And to follow on with your central thesis about or fake history or the absence of understanding or appreciation or knowledge of history, you've only got to look back at somebody like Augustine of Hippo, possibly the preeminent early father of the early Christian church, 300s, 400s. And he certainly said that you could fight to defend the faith. It's not about invading and taking over new territory and forced conversion, but where Christianity and kith and kin and fellow Christians were at threat, Augustine of Hippo said, defend. At the point of the lance, but defense. And ideas like the meek shall inherit the earth. That's been so corrupted because as you'll know, I mean, you're a philologist and an etymologist and you speak multiple languages, but that meek is translated via praus, which is descriptive of the way in which you take a wild horse and you train it to be not a skittish, unpredictable creature, but to be a focused war horse that will obey the commands of its rider and will be fearless. This is the means by which we get meek, which is nothing to do with crawling around on your hands and knees and being apologetic. And yet all of that is, and these, like you say, Jesus throwing over the tables, but all sorts of figures from the Christian past who were so irascible, who were so prepared, unarmed or not, to stand up and throw their weight around in defense of the faith. And yet somewhere along the line, since Augustine of Hippo or whoever, Christianity has ended up with this slumped-shouldered, kick me around if you must. Yep. It's bizarre.
Yeah, that's a relatively new, when you look at the continuum of Christian history, because well after Augustine, the church was still very militant. It's almost 1,000 years later is when you have, the high points of the crusade, or about 800 years later. But I do believe that this is all by design. In other words, the people who are promoting this, once again, just like I said, when you have whoever creates commercials, the people in charge, and they put blacks and they act like we're doing this because we like them, when they're really trying to stoke a race war, okay? These are the same people who are telling Christians, look, this is what the Bible says. You have to turn the other cheek. You have to be meek, like you said with that definition. They do that because they hate Christianity and they want to disarm it and make it weak and susceptible precisely for what's happening. So there is what we see happening. So Christians are being mowed down and they are doormats who do nothing, who think all that's for them to do is to pray and turn the other cheek. Okay. And, if that's, I was reading, a sermon from a medieval sermon, and it was basically making the good point, saying if it was all about praying and going, into a monastery, then look, what did the disciples do? They suffered. They had to go. They worked. They, preached, etc. They died. So obviously there's an activity component involved, and it's not just being passive and sitting around. That is, I think, again, the people who are behind this hate Christianity, and again, but they seem to be promoting it, when what they're promoting is not even really Christianity. It's a way of destroying it.
Do you think, to take it to, you mentioned the simplicity of the message and the civilizing nature of the message of Christianity, which, many people say it boils down to two fundamental tenets of love thy neighbour as thyself and love God. But neither of the other monotheisms were tolerant at all in that way. Both Judaism and Islam were about it's us and them, and God likes us. And we annihilate and we tear down and we utterly destroy everybody else because that's the way God wants it. And I think arguably theologically both Judaism and Islam worship Jehovah, you worship the same God of the Old Testament. And I wonder if there's a timeless antagonism about the fact that Jesus arrived and was saying to his disciples, this God that you're worshipping is not the Father that I recognize. He talks in Matthew and Luke about, the father of lies and the murderer, and what kind of a father behaves like this. That's not the Father. And I wonder if it's the very threat of being told to love thy neighbour that was something that those of a conquering, intolerant, murderous intent couldn't thole. They couldn't tolerate. And that above all, from ancient times made Christianity put it in the crosshairs for destruction. Yeah,
it did. And, the point about Jehovah and Allah, this goes way back. There's Marcion, who's considered a heretic. And I think he was one of the very earliest, they won't call him a church father now, but he was convinced that the God of the Old Testament was not the Father of the New Testament, that was an imposter God. So that train of thought has obviously been there, and for some reason, because there is obvious, Christian apologetics now is such, oh no, of course, the New Testament and Old Testament God are identical, different manifestations, different eras, different whatever. But I can definitely see that. But the message, and again, the message of love thy, neighbor. And again, we need to be careful with words. The word is love, as you say, but I often, the word today, when you hear the word love, it's so sentimental and sappy. But of course, in the Greek, philos or agape, in this case, in the New Testament case, it means to will the good for the other, right? I will, and I actively try to bring what I would want in my life. I want to bring it to my fellow man. Okay. So there's nothing sentimental or sappy about it. But I think today when people hear, love in a Christian context, there's again this just sort of cloying element to it, which I dislike and personally find it unappealing. But it was universal. It was revolutionary. I mean, the things that Jesus taught, because up until then, everything was tribal. I go into this a lot. I talk about how the genius of Muhammad is that he really deified tribalism. If you really dig into the core teachings of Islam, it's basically tribalism, but on steroids. It's the same construct, but in a different way. And now, as opposed to just preying on the other, which was what tribalism is, you still prey on the other, but then you also go to heaven. You're pious, you're good, you're a holy person for doing that. So I think and you look at the progress of history, and it's the religion that did teach love and forgiveness that actually, after all was said and done, rose to the top. Right? Even though it was being bombarded left and right. And there were times where it could have been snuffed out entirely, as it was in the heartland of Christendom, the North Africa and the Middle East. It could have happened. And yet it survived and prevailed. And now we've reached the day where, the people who are destroying it and the forces who are destroying it are those within. And always those within are much more dangerous than those without. Those without you can identify and you know who they are and you can actually stand against them. But those within, these fifth columns, they're the real problem. Because, you don't see them and, they get away with all sorts of things and they just blend in. So obviously that's what's happening, but it's been happening so slowly and so incrementally. I often liken Western civilization sort of to the boiling frog analogy where, if you put a frog in hot water and just raise it slowly and slowly and slowly, he'll die and he won't jump out. If you put him in a boiling pot, then he'll jump out. He'll feel it. And if you look at the progress of Western civilization, it's, what we call the left. It presupposes a continuum, right? Right, left, center, and that somehow the center is neutral and the other two are still part of it, but to me, you know, what we call today's the left is just completely without any foundation and should be called as such. What's been happening in the West is, you know, the leftist things have happened so incrementally that nobody ever noticed it. So I was watching a video, for example, from the 1950s in a California school. As I'm sure you know, California is the most liberal state. And it's a principal or administrator warning students against homosexuality. And, you know, and there's actual commercials made warning children, and they use, you know, very, inflammatory terms, not just homosexuality. It's very offensive. Okay. And you wonder, like, how did we get to that, to where now, like, you know, men and women are interchangeable? Okay. Well, we didn't get that way all of a sudden. What happened is it happened incrementally. So all of a sudden in the 60s or whatever, all these scientists, same one, the predecessors of those who brought us COVID hysteria, decided that homosexuality was now perfectly fine because it used to be considered, you know, a disease. And then slowly you start getting all these sympathetic homosexual characters in sitcoms and movies and whatever. And people start saying, yeah, okay, fine. But then, and all they want, of course, is just to be accepted and not be in the closet. But, and all of that again seems reasonable. Oh, okay. But then you see what happens and it just keeps progressing, where a person can't even identify what a man is, or a woman is. Okay. And so that's what I mean. It's happening. It's being engineered, but very incrementally, like the boiling frog, so that those who are Americans, Europeans, etc., who are suffering from this don't feel it because it happens so slowly, generationally almost.
What is in it? To go back to an earlier point in the conversation, what is in it for those supposed so-called Western leaders who are so part of this destruction? What might be in it for them, and what is the end game? You know, if Europe, European civilization, Western civilization, Britain, Christendom, Christianity are brought down, what then? What is it that is the objective that inspires so much dedicated effort down through the centuries and seems to be intensifying, exponentially at the moment? You know, as though someone has really put their foot on the gas. What's the what's the end game?
That is the question. And, you know, one can speculate, and there's different kind of avenues one can go down. One of them, you know, you asked about the political leaders who are behind this. A lot of people will tell you, well, they're just so indoctrinated. They've been drinking their own, you know, Kool-Aid, as they say, meaning they believe their own woke mantras. And so they actually really believe that the white man is, you know, has to make up for his sins against everyone. And therefore we have to open our borders, and and if we don't, we're racist. So I imagine there's some of that amongst the, you know, less intelligent ones. They're most of the people who are pushing this are indoctrinated in this, but they're lower levels. Upper level, you know, the movers and shakers that we don't know who they are. I don't think that's what they think. I do think there is a concerted effort to destroy Christianity and Christians. There's a hatred for it, and it's an ancient hatred. And, you know, it's manifests itself all throughout history. Again, you know, I talk about Islamic history with the West, but even outside of Islam, there was a lot of hatred and a lot of subversion going against Christianity throughout from its very get-go. And I think this is, you know, you can even call it Satanism, whatever. You know, that's just another avenue that we can go down. Or, you know, the global elite, and they're trying to retransform society by doing whatever. Okay. But again, I do believe, why is it that it's always Christianity that is under attack? It really is. It's nothing else. Once you become a secular white person, then okay, you've lost essentially your identity, and now you're just another pawn in the field that can be used. Your emotions can be manipulated anyway through the powers that be again. But you know, where Christians can be killed, they're being killed. Okay. All in the third world. Where they can be discriminated against, they're being discriminated against. And then in the area where Christianity created its home and where it developed and where it's great, Europe, America, it's another kind of attack. It's more insidious because they're not there yet. They can't walk around the streets butchering Christians. Okay. But it's, you know, it's all these laws against, you know, the free speech attacks on Christians. In New York, I'll give you one example. This happened 2 weeks ago. New York City mayor, before, mosques could not proclaim the call to prayer. In Islamic countries, in the mosques, they actually, when it's the times for prayer, they get on megaphones, and it's very disturbing to people, Muslims and non-Muslims especially. And the stuff they say is actually also very supremacist and anti-infidel. Okay. And that's what happens. So now the New York mayor has allowed the mosques to do that. Okay. Even though they weren't allowed before. Do you think that mayor would ever allow Christian churches to blast through megaphones, the gospel or anything like that? Obviously not. Never. So it's very obvious wherever you look that there is a concerted effort to undermine Christianity. Okay. And one of the ways which I just described is by telling you, no, Christianity is great. Follow it. But Christianity is all about, prosperity, mega churches, and turning the other cheek. Well, yeah, sure. That's a great kind of Christianity. But the true forms, okay, are just completely under attack. And that's why I'm telling you, of all the ways that bring people to religion, I'm weird because with me, it's more my knowledge and intimate knowledge of history and current events and, that continuity that's showing me there's something against Christianity. That means there must be something for it, something about it. How this message, which for all intents and purposes is so benevolent and altruistic and has done so much good throughout the world. And yet every force from every angle is doing everything they can to destroy it and besmirch it.
It seems to me that it's the answer to the question is that uniquely, the true fundamental Jesus-based Christian message, like what Jesus came to do was to establish the sovereignty of the individual and to make I've got a real problem with an anti-human agenda. I believe all the trouble in the world is being driven by the oligarchs and whatever, by the bankers and the neocons, by a profoundly anti-human objective. And I think Christianity, of the three monotheisms, was about the triumph of the individual. Judaism, as I understand it, is essentially about observance. It's about obeying rules. These are the rules, and if you it's wrong to disobey the rules. It's not about the essential rightness. It's just the path to success is to observe the rules, whatever they may be. And Islam, by definition, by the word itself, is about submission. Submit. Set aside what you might achieve as an individual for the collective tribal greater good. Christianity is not like your Christianity. The Jewish God of the Old Testament promised only worldly rewards: women, gold, cattle, sheep, whatever. But Christianity was promising something else, and it all comes back to the sanctity of the individual. And I think because we are in an anti-human era, the faith that is all about the human, the humanity of the human being, that's, I think, intrinsically why it's in the crosshairs. Yeah.
Because the powers that be don't want individuals who are free thinkers, and free people. They want collectives. Islam, as you mentioned, is all about the collective. So many other religions and ideologies are as well. So I think, again, one can approach Christianity and these questions from a theological paradigm or a historical paradigm, but, it's very obvious to those who can see what's really happening. And again, you won't see it without a historical understanding. And this is the problem, as you mentioned right at the beginning, everything is presented in a vacuum. So you don't, when you hear Christianity as being a doormat, yeah, that's all I've ever heard. That's every church says that, right? So that must be what it is until you realize, no, historically it was not like that at all. It was actually very, like I said, very robust religion. But just all these things are doing what they can to just, and one can put labels and one can try to, ascertain the identification of these forces, these nefarious forces. But that too is problematic and, can create all sorts of problems, especially if you say or think the wrong thing. And as you know, in the UK with all these laws. To go back to that, because I wanted to say this when you mentioned it, the 30 arrests a day because of what people say. I mean, how do people like you, by which I mean intelligent people who understand what's going on, what is your response? I mean, this is like open war has been declared on you by your own leaders. This is now, how can anyone rationalize this away? This isn't just, oh, we have to do this because of this. No, they're stealing your rights now. The number one most prized right, freedom of expression, free speech, is gone. And what are people saying? You're telling me that saying something about migrants or whatever, it will get you more jail time than pedophilia. You know, it was like, so, and here comes the point. Western man has been so emasculated and, so pacified that, in other words, if this was happening in any other context, let's say if this was the UK 100 years ago, I think that government would be overthrown through violence. Okay. Saying, well, that's the story of the United States. That's the Revolutionary War, right? People took arms. They didn't say, oh, well, let's keep taking it and turning the other cheek. I'm sure they mean well. So here are the fruits of the ultimate emasculation and pacification of Western man. He's just become docile. And, because you, by which I mean people in the UK in particular and, in Europe in general, I mean, your own leaders have declared war on you. It's so obvious. And, what are people doing? And I'm not saying it's so easy to take up arms. I get it. That's problematic too. But, it's over. If people don't get it and don't respond, and I don't mean by hashtagging and going on Twitter and complaining, but I mean, coming up with a plan, because the people who lord over you are not going to change. They're not going to change their way. Why should they? Because they see it's working. So as long as people are so passive, this is just going to accelerate.
Yeah, I mean, our government now, the Labour government of Keir Starmer, it demonstrably loathes, certainly the indigenous population of Britain, loathes the very sort of archetype of what it had been to be British. Not land of hope and glory, Union Jack waving, last night at the proms British, just British. Just, the kind of people that just wanted to live peaceably with their neighbours, have a job, see their children safe and well educated. That kind of British. Fair play, equality before the law, and so on and so on. And they're demonstrably loathed by the people in authority. And I think it had to go this way, because for the longest time, I think that element was woven through, it was part of the body, the greater body, but by a strange process, the powerful, or the powers that ought not to be, I think are kind of bifurcating away. They're almost budding away, like a cell division. And they are in the process of becoming a separate entity altogether, but very small. And because they'll be completely separate with no connection whatever, in terms of humanity, in terms of ideology, in terms of aspiration, in terms of objectives, they will have nothing in common with the body of the British people whatsoever. They will in a moment become highly visible, and I suppose thereby they're vulnerable, I suppose. So I think this process that we're going through, where the mask slips, it's like that bit in the movie, where the kidnapper's mask comes off, and you think, oh well, this guy's not going home because the kidnapped person, can identify. And it's all part of that process. And I do think that there is still something of old Britain that is there, that is foundational. And that this process is going to reveal these worthless, anti-human, powerful, for what they are. But we're just not there yet. But I think all of this, because, Britain has been a Christian country and took unto itself that message of the right of the human being, the really chippy, determined right of the individual, to get up in the face of authority, to not just be barked at by uniforms and the powerful is still there. And I think it will, it will be a massive effort, but I do think it's possible to overturn the anti-human agenda.
One of the ideas I have is, when you look throughout history and there's negative, corrupt governments or whatever, they never go away until war is declared, okay, until there's a rise up. Do you think that's possible? In other words, in as much as this group keeps separating itself and identifying itself and standing out from the general, do you think that the people would ever actually, And this is the thing that I'm curious about. I don't think Western people are capable anymore of actually taking up arms and overthrowing a corrupt government. I think they've been completely paralyzed.
Britain and Europe largely are very different because we have been disarmed.
Yeah, literally.
When you talk about taking up arms, no one's got any.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that.
That's been a long, slow attritional process by which the people have been disarmed. I would say as a form of emasculation. That was part of a process of beating people down into unnecessarily submissive posture. But I do think there's enormous power in, even, famously, I suppose, Gandhi. It's the mass of opposition, and Gandhi preached a kind of a peaceful turning away, a disobedience, and I do think there's a possibility of an iteration, a sort of 2.0 of that kind of behaviour. I think a mass turning away from these people would disempower them because they don't have any backbone. They don't have. I don't believe that they have the stomach for the wet work that true totalitarianism requires. I think they're getting away with what they can get away with while there is absolutely no opposition to what they're doing. But if there was to be a mass turning away, a civil disobedience, a declaration by the mass of the population that we're setting you aside, you're no longer relevant, then I think that's got potential because. We are, and have been for the longest time, a disarmed population. America, were there to be a revolution in America, it would be a horse of a different colour, I'm quite sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I get your point. If they get so alienated, they're not of the true cast of a true tyrant, but they'll still have the military on their side. You can look around, a place like North Korea, you got this psychopath and he's in power because he has the military. A lot of people don't like him, obviously. And you get a lot of that. But I see your point too, that those people may not have the stomach for that sort of, extreme alienation. They need some support.
The British military, you could fit in a football stadium with seats to spare. And the necessary, as it were, the necessary jackboots are not there unless there's some sort of mass recruitment of someone, because the numbers aren't there. And furthermore, I honestly believe that the British Army would side with the people. If push came to shove, small and ill-treated though the British Armed Forces have been, I believe in my heart that they would side with the people.
Yeah.
So
that still happens. It happened in Egypt. The Sisi, he was a military man, and they got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. Whether it's better or worse, that's a different story, but that does still happen. So yeah, it's just really crazy times. And, but it's interesting to see that how the West and Europe, its ultimate downfall or the events leading up to it have not been through violence. That has not worked. Historically, it's been through violence because that's the cleanest form of warfare. It's the most obvious kind. And, Europe's forebears weren't about to be manipulated into committing suicide. So the only way to attack them was through violence. But again, all these ideologies and isms over the last couple of centuries have just so addled, I think, the brain of so many people that they are their own worst enemies. They've been taught to destroy themselves by these hidden forces, to the point where they're at today. Imagine, I often wonder if, because I write a lot about crusaders and medieval history, and these guys, I often wonder if they came to life today and saw their descendants, how they're just completely just destroying everything they worked so hard for.
Is it just, as as so many people say, is it just the fall of empire? Is it analogous, to what happened to the fall of the Roman Empire, that it comes not because of pressure from without necessarily, but from exhaustion and lack of confidence from within. And it really is. And I think part of the antidote to that would be, ironically, or not ironically, but given our conversation has been so much about Christianity, I would say that, that there's it's an obligation of Christianity to have faith in the darkest times. It's you don't get to drop your shoulders, because you rightly, rather than that meekness, which is really irrelevant, that muscular form of Christianity that was there for a long time and was there in the beginning, is predicated upon the obligation of the individual, to stand up as a light in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. It's there in the fundamental tenets of the faith, and perhaps there would be that necessity to look to an older, simpler, muscular form of what has been the underpinnings of Christendom.
Yeah. And that's actually been one of my main interests. My books have been about that. My last book, it's called Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. And if you look, it's biographies, 8 biographies of kings and emperors and warlords, crusaders, essentially. And when you look at them, it's amazing how pious they were on the one hand and how militant they were on the other. And the twain did not contradict each other at all. You'd think, today by our standards of what Christianity is, oh, he's a terrible hypocrite. But they had no problems whatsoever reconciling it, because to them it was just what they were doing. They were defending the poor, the orphan, the widow, from, in this case, Muslims, all right, during the Crusades. And this is the kind of Christianity I'm advocating for, and I think is needed in the West. Okay, not a conquering, violent Christianity, but one that at least it believes in self-preservation and defense of the weak, and standing up for the weak, and standing up against the bullies. Right? Not just being a doormat, which is what they've conditioned Christians into thinking they are. So, I think that just gravitating towards that. And I'll be honest with you. When I talk about those guys and medieval characters and, crusader types, there's a lot of pushback, including from people you would think like this. And I think there's this fear amongst the people who've worked so hard to convince Christians to be doormats. They don't want them to reclaim their real heritage. First, it's very attractive. When people read these characters, I mean, you'll be surprised just how much they write to me. My eyes have opened. I love this. I want to be this kind of Christian. And I think that's what they're terrified of, that Christians will gravitate back to that more robust form, which would be the first step towards, I think, resolving a lot of these issues we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that one. I mean, you can make it apocryphal, you can make it a legend or mythology or whatever. But Pelagius, whatever, the Prince of Asturias.
Yeah. I have a whole chapter on him.
who retreats into the mountains of Asturias, and then but is there. He's like, he is enough. Yeah. And thereby were laid the foundations, the stubborn root that enabled the Reconquista and all of the rest of it.
Where's the movie for him? Where's the movie? This is a true story. It would be a blockbuster movie, but hey, he's Christian. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about a Christian fighting and making a comeback against Muslims, right? Yeah. So we're just going to give you fiction and create stories in Hollywood. But yeah, they don't want people to be aware of that kind of thing. And this is, I think, another reason I think there's a general sense amongst Europeans that medieval history is horrible. It's just terrible. These are bigoted, evil, racist, xenophobic Christians. In fact, I think that was one of the high times of Europe, that era. And I think these powers don't want people to know that. They want them to disassociate. They want today's Europeans and Westerners to dissociate themselves from that era by thinking it's just evil. Because if you actually look at it and you study it and you understand what it was really about, it's very attractive. You might want to emulate it. So I think that's something I've been discovering in my own journey of researching and writing and presenting on these particular topics. I've been surprised to see the sort of pushback I get from people who you would have thought are allies, but they have a different agenda.
Yeah, Christianity spent enough time on its knees.
Seriously.
I'm just looking at the clock. You've been so generous with your time, Raymond Ibrahim. I've just been carried away by having a conversation with you. I'd love to have another conversation, picking up on some of these themes and then opening doors into others. But for now, thank you so much. We will speak again, I hope.
Thanks very much, Neil. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to it.